The setting, shadows over an American metropolis. Picture a city that pulses with energy at all hours, a metropolis stitched together by steel, glass, history, and ambition. This is New York, a living, breathing organism that shapes dreams and sometimes nightmares. The story begins far from the glossy lights of Broadway, away from the polished avenues of Fifth and Madison. Instead, our tale unfolds in the labyrinthine streets of Washington Heights, an uptown neighborhood perched on the northern edge of Manhattan. Here, the air is thick with the echoes of both old-world immigrants and restless new generations chasing the spirit of the city that never sleeps. Washington Heights, or simply the Heights to locals, sits atop rugged bluffs nearly 140 meters above the Hudson River, offering panoramic views of both the water and the concrete jungle sprawling beneath. In the early 1980s, it was a district in transition, a tapestry woven from cultures as varied as the bodegas and old-school barbershops dotting Broadway, the Latin jazz floating from basement clubs, and the laughter of Dominican, Puerto Rican, Irish, and Jewish families mingling in sunlit courtyards. Street murals whispered of revolution and resilience, while the faded facades of pre-war apartments kept centuries of stories behind their stoic brickwork. Yet beneath the surface beauty and the creative ferment, a sense of unease lingered. Paranoia grew sharper as the sun set behind the George Washington Bridge. Rumors spread like wildfire, unexplained disappearances, strange noises echoing from alleyways, a creeping dread that the towering sycamores and elms hid more than just lovers on evening walks. It was as though the city itself had a shadow self, one that slithered free after dusk, cloaked in the anonymity New York so easily provides. The neighborhood's unique topography, its twisting stairways, hidden parks, and thicketed backyards, became the perfect haven for secrets and specters. The community, still healing from the urban strife and economic shocks of the 1970s, now braced itself every night as local papers reported a string of inexplicable attacks. A pattern formed, targeting elderly women living alone, a demographic perceived as both vulnerable and invisible in this ever-moving city. The police patrolled, neighbors triple-bolted their doors, but the attacks continued. Often, the only evidence left behind was the echo of footsteps vanishing down stone stairwells, and the breathless headlines that began christening the neighborhood's unseen terror, the Monster of Washington Heights. But this is not just a story about fear or about the predator and the prey. It is an exploration of a place caught between its proud, storied heritage and the new, sometimes unforgiving realities of urban life in America. In every shadow there is an untold story, whether it belongs to the hopeful immigrant, the weary cop, or the monstrous force lurking just out of sight. Washington Heights, at the dawn of our story, is more than just a backdrop. It is a living, shifting character whose wounds, triumphs, and mysteries are as much a part of this dark chapter as the figures that haunt it. The origin of a tragedy. Let's wind the clock back to a frosty Thursday morning, November 28, 1963, at St. Luke's Hospital nestled in the heart of Manhattan, a city still buzzing from the shock of JFK's assassination just 1 week prior. In a corner maternity ward, a 17-year-old girl named Madeline brought her son Kevin into the world, her hands trembling with both anticipation and despair. The room pulsed with cries of newborns and the distant wailing of sirens, reminders that nothing paused, not even for the monumental shifts in a single family's fate. Madeline herself was the daughter of a first-generation Italian-American restaurateur in the Bronx, a woman known for her relentless work ethic and perhaps her equally relentless pride. Kevin's birth was not greeted with family joy, but with whispers in the corridor and the quick shuffling of feet, as if shame could be swept aside with brisk movement. Kevin's father, an amateur jazz guitarist with dreams bigger than his sense of responsibility, had vanished shortly after Madeline confessed to the pregnancy, leaving her marooned in uncertainty and social scrutiny. Alone and overwhelmed, Madeline tried for several months to cradle both her baby and the remnants of teenage dreams, but the weight was crushing. Bills piled on the kitchen counter like an avalanche, and Madeline's eyes grew hollow from endless shifts waiting tables at her mother's bustling Bronx diner. Eventually the decision was made. The toddler would move in with his grandmother, whose small success in business came at the cost of personal warmth. She housed Kevin in a tiny attic bedroom above the kitchen, where the aroma of garlic and roasting meats seeped through the floorboards, mingling with the persistent hush of loneliness. Kevin's childhood was a silent drift through crowded rooms where laughter and banter orbited around him without ever drawing him in. Holidays passed with him watching the backs of adults, learning early how easily young lives can be overshadowed by the inertia of grown-up disappointments. No toys in brightly colored wrapping or gentle lullabies. Kevin's world was one of clattering pots, the drone of sports radio, and the distant thunder of subway trains. He absorbed the quiet prejudices of neighbors who eyed Madeline's situation with pity and suspicion, internalizing the sense of otherness that clung to him like city dust. As Kevin grew, so too did his hunger for attention, and the resentment that sprouted when it wasn't forthcoming. Teachers at the local public school described him as withdrawn, yet unpredictable, a boy who could launch into laughter or a fistfight with equally little provocation. Sometimes he wandered Broadway, pressing his nose against pawnshop windows, imagining escape routes. Other times he simply vanished for hours, curling up in the shadowy recesses of Riverside Park, inventing stories for himself to fill the void. By the time Madeline remarried, bringing Kevin a stepfather and step-siblings, his defenses had calcified. He regarded each new household rule as an implicit betrayal, an attempt to erase what shaky sense of identity he'd managed to assemble. Arguments echoed down the hallway, sometimes ending in broken plates, sometimes in bruised arms, and always with the stepfather's weary admonition that Kevin was trouble, a problem best solved by distance. The process stripped away what little softness remained in the household, leaving each member cocooned in their own wounded solitude. The seeds of tragedy, carried quietly on the city's winter winds, had already taken root. A childhood marked by isolation and resentment. Kevin's earliest memories were painted in the muted colors of loneliness amidst the cacophony of family life. While the small Bronx apartment was busy with his grandmother's employees moving in and out, chefs barking orders in the kitchen, waitresses chit-chatting during rare breaks, the telephone ringing non-stop, Kevin himself rarely felt like anything but a background character. Family meals often played out with his mother Madeline, too drained from double shifts to make eye contact, and his grandmother obsessing over sales numbers rather than school grades. He learned very young that the loudest voice at the table didn't necessarily bring warmth, nor did the constant bustle dispel the ache of being overlooked. Holidays passed in a haze of half-hearted traditions. Kevin watched other children in the neighborhood build snowmen in winter, play stickball in sun-streaked alleyways in spring, but he lingered on the sidelines, trying to decipher the secret pathways into such belonging. His presents were practical: sensible woolen socks, a used baseball glove, once a stack of school workbooks, items that emphasized utility over affection. The gap between him and the world widened with every passing birthday, with every whispered remark from elderly neighbors about that poor fatherless boy upstairs. School became a battleground of its own. By third grade, teachers labeled him difficult. He struggled to focus, his attention drifting during lessons, but exploded in brief fits of anger or impulsive outbursts. A chair kicked over, a door slammed, sometimes a sharp response to a perceived slight from a classmate. Counselors suggested he might need special support, but appointments were missed, paperwork lost, and Madeline herself, juggling bills and busy work, treated parent-teacher conferences as another chore to be survived. Kevin's grades slipped, friends remained elusive, bullies, sensing an easy target, tormented him in the corridors, stealing his lunch or mocking his hand-me-down clothes. Increasingly, Kevin found solace in solitude. He wandered the block, inventing imaginary games to pass the empty hours, sometimes muttering conversations aloud as if to an invisible friend. He'd press his nose against pawnshop windows along Broadway, daydreaming of escape via the glittering necklaces and glinting guitars that rested just out of reach. Sometimes he climbed to the apartment roof to watch the city's endless chaos below, sirens ricocheting off brick walls, lights flickering in distant windows, a panorama that affirmed just how small and unnoticed he was. Within the family, things grew even more fraught when Madeline remarried. Kevin was suddenly cast into a blended household with older stepbrothers who treated him more as a rival than a sibling. The dynamic at home shifted. Family dinners morphed into tense standoffs with his stepfather's stern silences and the stepbrothers' pointed jokes making every meal a minefield. Kevin pushed back in the only ways he knew, by staging tiny rebellions, refusing to clean up, or fighting back when provoked. When arguments inevitably escalated into shouting matches, his grandmother would sigh in exasperation, muttering in Italian about Malocchio, the evil eye, having settled over the house. His stepfather, already overwhelmed by his own responsibilities, saw Kevin as a liability, a reminder of mistakes and burdens. He accused Madeline of coddling her son, blaming Kevin for all the family strife. The rift grew deeper. Physical clashes were not uncommon. Kevin became known for his quick temper, shocking both adults and peers with the intensity and unpredictability of his anger. Any glimmer of warmth or reconciliation was fleeting, snuffed out amid slammed doors and bruised pride. By the time Kevin was 10, he developed a thick skin and a repertoire of coping mechanisms. Humor that sometimes bordered on cruelty, a bravado that masked deep insecurity, and a stubborn refusal to trust in anyone's affection. The isolation bred not only resentment for those he perceived as rejecting him, but an ongoing suspicion that reaching out for help would only lead to more disappointment. The Bronx, with its relentless hustle and constant noise, became the backdrop for a young boy's growing conviction: if he wanted to survive, he'd have to do it alone. The journey for love and disappointment. Kevin's quest for love and acceptance began the minute he was separated from his mother and shuttled off to live with his father in Texas, a man he'd only known through faded photographs and brief awkward letters mailed during holidays. Landing in Houston at age 12 felt like stepping into another dimension. The city boasted endless strip malls, sunburned freeways, and neighborhoods divided sharply by race, culture, and economics. Kevin, already bruised by years of emotional neglect, now had to navigate an alien landscape, complete with a father whose blue-collar demeanor was as cold and distant as the air-conditioned living room they shared. It quickly became clear that Kevin would not be welcomed as a son, but rather tolerated as an obligation, an extra mouth to feed in a household run by silent resentments and unspoken rules. His father, a rough-spoken mechanic, saw in Kevin only the failures of his past relationship with Madeline, and perhaps an unwelcome reminder of his own irresponsibility. They rarely spoke. When they did, their conversations consisted mostly of short commands and clipped acknowledgments. "Did you eat? Homework done? Lights out." Kevin, ever sensitive to rejection, retreated into himself, seeking solace in the glow of the small television in his bedroom, and the company of paperbacks that transported him to worlds where broken families could be mended. School was hardly kinder. Kevin was neither Texan nor New Yorker. He spoke with a trace of his mother's Bronx accent, dressed in thrift store clothes that never quite fit the trends, and found himself on the fringe of every lunch table. An easy target, he was caught between the boisterous local kids who dismissed him as weird, and the outsiders who were too wary to trust his confused, defensive humor. In time, Kevin gravitated toward the only group that seemed to understand what it felt like to stand on society's margins, the so-called Lost Boys, a ragtag collection of misfits, runaways, and juvenile delinquents who lived by their own anarchic code. Here, Kevin tasted a distorted version of camaraderie: late-night joyrides on stolen bikes, back-alley pizza slices shared under sodium-orange streetlights, cigarettes passed in huddled circles behind the gym. In a sense, these friendships offered a refuge from the rejection of home and school. But underneath the bravado and reckless fun simmered an ocean of anger and pain. The guidance counselors and teachers viewed Kevin's group as trouble waiting to happen. Police cruisers slowed whenever the boys appeared on the corner, suspicious glares betraying the adults' fear and disappointment. Yet, even among his new family, Kevin never escaped the sense of being an outsider. There were moments of warmth, sure. A slap on the back, a secret handshake, the shared thrill of breaking the rules, but true intimacy always seemed just out of reach. It didn't help that Kevin was beginning to grasp his own difference, a growing awareness of his sexuality, a tentative crush here or there that had to be hidden or joked away. When the subject of queers came up, his friends' jokes were tinged with venom, and Kevin laughed along, tucking his secret deeper into the shadows. Over the next few years, the gap between fantasy and reality widened for Kevin. He watched other kids receive birthday cards, phone calls from dads who meant well, hugs from mothers who fussed over their grades. He told himself he didn't need those things, even as he ached for them in the quiet moments after midnight, listening to the drone of freight trains in the dark. Once he confided in a sympathetic art teacher about the ache below his ribs, the longing to belong, the fear of never being enough. But the moment passed, the teacher moved away, and Kevin was left, again, staring up at a ceiling that offered no answers. Bit by bit, disappointment became his constant companion. Every failed friendship, every awkward morning in his father's house, every sideways glance in the halls at school reinforced the certainty that love, real, unconditional love, was for other people, not for boys like him, not for boys who carried the shadows of New York in their bones. By the time he turned 16, Kevin had become an expert at masking pain with anger, at turning vulnerability into dark humor or outright defiance. But behind every sharp joke and every clenched fist, the dream of being loved refused to die, flickering faintly through the storm of his disappointment. A life-changing turning point, the military and abandonment. At 17, Kevin made a decision that felt equal parts impulsive and inevitable. He ran away from Texas, forged his birth date, and enlisted in the U.S. Army. To him, basic training in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, represented a clean slate, a way to cast off the shadow of a splintered family and years of rejection. The military, with its unyielding code of discipline, seemed to offer a sense of order and purpose that had always eluded him. For a short time, it almost worked. In those first weeks under the relentless southern sun, Kevin found himself both challenged and exhilarated. Sore muscles and sleep deprivation shared space with the odd thrill of camaraderie during silent pre-dawn runs and the taste of grit at the rifle range. But the Army was also another world sharply divided by invisible lines of race, class, and most painfully for Kevin, sexuality. It wasn't long before the rumors began to swirl. Kevin was, by necessity, unguarded. He didn't care to hide his quick wit or small gestures of affection with the few trainees he trusted. The barracks, though, are places where secrets quickly become weapons. Whispered slurs, stolen glances, and the sense of something not quite right followed him everywhere. His status as a mixed-race recruit from the North set him apart from the predominantly white, Southern-born officers and soldiers. His queerness, although never stated aloud, made him a target for suspicion and thinly veiled hostility. A handful of sympathetic souls drifted in and out of Kevin's orbit, a sergeant who once nodded at him in the mess hall, a bunkmate who offered a silent hand after a rough day. Yet these islands of solace were fleeting. Most nights Kevin lay awake on a thin cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to the far-off hum of generators and the laughter on the other side of the platoon's wall. He ached for the sense of belonging he'd imagined would come from wearing the uniform. In its place he found only another lesson in what it meant to be on the outside looking in. The incident that sealed his fate wasn't dramatic, a minor infraction during scheduled leave, an argument that grew too loud, a flash of anger that spiraled out of control. Kevin's temper, nursed for years on a steady diet of rejection, flared. Instead of a second chance, the Army's response was swift and uncompromising. Officially, it was a dishonorable discharge for conduct unbecoming. Unofficially, it was explained to him, in the gray light of the Sarge's office, that no one had time for problem soldiers, especially not ones who didn't fit or made others uncomfortable. When Kevin boarded the bus bound back to New York, duffel bag heavy with regret, he felt the old, familiar sting of failure creeping in. The bitter taste of being turned away by yet another place he wanted desperately to call home lingered. He pressed his forehead against the window as the country blurred by, convinced he was destined to wander. Never quite soldier, never quite son, always the complicated other whose search for acceptance led only to new forms of exile. Nightlife revelations and glittering dreams. In the years that followed, Kevin found himself drawn irresistibly to the heartbeat of New York after dark, a world so utterly unlike any he had known in the Bronx, Houston, or Fort Bragg. Greenwich Village pulsed with color, sound, and bodies in motion, a kaleidoscope of stories and secrets spilling out from the doors of nightclubs, late-night diners, and sidewalk bars. The village was a sanctuary where, for the first time, Kevin didn't have to shrink away or put on a mask. Here, the air itself seemed to buzz with possibility, as if electricity danced across every rain-soaked street and neon sign. For countless young queer people, these few blocks offered the only real escape from the daily onslaught of judgment and repression, Kevin included. It was here, under the pink and violet glow of streetlights, that Kevin was reborn. He started working as a performer at Neon Dreams, a legendary drag club tucked beneath an old tenement. During the day, Kevin met the world's apathy with the same old armor: sarcasm, hardened stares, a silence built on years of disappointment. But at night, under layers of elaborate makeup and wigs that transformed him into someone else entirely, he could step out onto the stage and become the person he had always wished to be. The audience's applause was intoxicating. Spotlights erased the outlines of his insecurities. For a few shining hours each night he was adored, seen, even celebrated. The Neon Dreams family was a collection of outsiders, artists, and visionaries from all walks of life. Runaways, poets, activists, lost souls who'd stumbled into the city with suitcases full of hope and heartbreak. Lola, the club owner and queen mother, ran her empire with both steel and compassion, offering sanctuary to those discarded by their own families. Backstage, the dressing room was a riot of color and chaos, sequins, high heels, perfume, laughter and tears shared in rapid sequence, everyone doing their best to become extraordinary together. It was noisy, often messy, sometimes cruel, yet above all it felt like home. Kevin, now Venus in his drag persona, reveled in this new life, clutching every friendship and every compliment as if it were a lifeline. Yet if the club's stage was heaven, the city outside remained unpredictable, a place of brilliance mixed with threat. Police raids, moral panics, and sudden acts of violence haunted the LGBTQ+ community like ghosts at the edge of every celebration. Kevin learned to read the signs of a city that alternated between indifference and aggression, the way a cop's gaze lingered too long, the hush that fell when a customer's laughter turned sour. Still, Neon Dreams offered a fragile sense of safety and purpose, and Kevin clung to the hope that, one day, he might headline the show, or even open a club of his own, a place where the rules would be different, where no one had to hide. In quiet moments, Kevin allowed himself the luxury of fantasy, seeing his name stenciled across a glowing marquee, hosting galas where every outcast danced without shame, transforming pain into art. But even the brightest dreams were chased by shadows. Success was fleeting and always conditional. Rejection, poverty, and heartbreak trailed close behind. Still, under the spinning disco lights, with the drums echoing in his ribcage and confetti in his hair, Kevin learned what it meant to truly belong, even if just for a night. Family upheaval and the descent into crime. The unraveling of Kevin's already fragile world came abruptly, triggered by a crescendo of family turmoil that had been simmering for years. The final blow landed on a foggy autumn night, right after one of Kevin's most dazzling performances at Neon Dreams. He'd stepped off the nightclub's stage, still aglow from applause that made him feel momentarily like he mattered. He craved acknowledgement from his mother, a sign she could accept this vibrant, unapologetic version of her child. Instead, he returned home to a volcanic argument. Madeline, still resolutely clinging to her old-world values and weary from years of hard survival, confronted Kevin with a flurry of accusations, shame, irresponsibility, and selfishness. The quarrel exploded into chaos, laced with hurtful words they could never take back. Madeline hurled Kevin's stage costume across the living room, sequins scattering like shrapnel. Kevin lashed back with years' worth of unspoken bitterness. Their shouting echoed through the apartment walls, neighbors pausing TV sets to listen with a mix of pity and schadenfreude. Hours later, the impasse ended with a harsh ultimatum. The next morning, Kevin found himself locked out, his belongings stuffed in garbage bags, his name spat with finality. The last shreds of family loyalty snapped clean. Homelessness in New York is never romantic. Kevin drifted for days, crashing with friends, bending the rules of hospitality until their generosity wore thin. He found a brittle lifeline with a new boyfriend, Xavier, a magnetic but volatile fixture in the city's underground party scene. Xavier represented everything Kevin thought he wanted: confidence, money to burn, an air of danger masked by a dazzling smile. With Xavier, Kevin submerged himself in a whirlwind of after-hours clubs, clandestine rooftop hangs, and endless neon-lit nights. It was exhilarating at first, a fevered rush of freedom after years of deprivation, but the lifestyle exacted a high price. Their need for money soon outpaced their insatiable appetite for pleasure. Bills came due, clubs wanted cover charges, dealers demanded payment up front. Xavier, experienced in cutting moral corners, suggested a way out: small-time thefts, easy marks, a bit of sleight of hand here, a wallet lifted there. Kevin hesitated, proud, even now, of his ability to survive without breaking the law. But hunger, pride, and desperation make for a dangerous cocktail. The first job was almost comically simple: an unattended purse at a crowded bar. It set his heart racing and his conscience howling, but the cash, once split, felt like a lifeline. The pattern escalated quickly. Unwilling to face shelters or welfare bureaucracy, and mostly ignored by indifferent police, Kevin rationalized his actions as temporary, a necessary evil in a city that had always taken more from him than it gave. Soon, their exploits grew bolder: burglaries in quiet neighborhoods just beyond the subway line, breaking into apartments of elderly women rumored to live alone, targeting homes where lights stayed off for nights on end. He told himself it was okay, that these people were far removed, almost imaginary, separated from him by more than just locked doors and creaky stairways. The crimes turned from opportunistic to violent. Kevin discovered a dark wellspring of anger, fueled by every indignity, every sneer and rejection he'd endured since boyhood. It was as if each broken lock, every panicked scream, released the pressure built up inside him. Xavier, for his part, egged him on, craving the money, the thrill, and perhaps the sense of domination that came from invading others' lives. Together they became infamous in whispered circles. Their names circulated among Manhattan's anxious elite as unseen terrors prowling the night. Kevin's transformation was complete. He'd left behind the lonely boy in the Bronx and the hopeful performer in the village. Now, he was a shadow moving silently through the city, unseen and unstoppable, caught in the undertow of violence and loss. The tragedy was that even in this spiral, all Kevin wanted was what he'd always wanted: acceptance, certainty, and a place to belong. But with every crime, he drifted further from those dreams, replacing connection with chaos and love with fear. When the nightmare gripped the city, escalating savagery and the mystery of the accomplice. In the shadows cast by an anxious city, the violence didn't simply escalate in frequency, it grew in cruelty, leaving police and citizens alike grasping for explanations. As the months ticked by, the string of assaults and murders that had begun almost as opportunistic acts evolved into something far more disturbing, a pattern marked by chilling savagery and psychological torment. Details whispered at first in police briefings and later leaked to the tabloids revealed new levels of horror. Victims were not only robbed, but left battered, sometimes bound, often traumatized in ways that suggested a fascination with pain itself. Kevin, whose own journey had always teetered on the edge between alienation and fury, now seemed compelled by a force deeper than desperation alone. Each crime was more calculated than the last, yet paradoxically wilder in its brutality. Neighbors who survived later spoke of masked nightmare figures who moved silently through the dark, communicating in glances and hand signals, always seeming to know exactly when a building's last police patrol had finished its rounds. Police forensics teams noticed the chilling signature, bruises arranged almost symmetrically, household relics smashed in patterns, the eerie quiet left in the wake of each escape. Eyewitnesses, when found, described not one but two figures, the first tall, wiry, and restless, the second shorter, but with the muscled tension of someone always ready to spring. While the city's rumor mill buzzed with the idea of a single monstrous predator, detectives grew increasingly convinced that Kevin was not acting alone. And in the nerve-wracking confusion of heightened police surveillance and frenzied neighborhood watch patrols, the identity of his accomplice remained a shifting phantom known only by half-seen gestures, muffled voices, the hush that followed a partner's muttered warning before a door was kicked in. The darkness deepened with each new crime. By spring, with daylight lingering longer in the sky, many believed the spree might fade, but instead the attacks became even bolder, striking in early evenings, daringly close to crowded avenue intersections. Underneath the growing media circus, the anguish of survivors and families mounted. Social workers and psychologists reported a spike in agoraphobia among the elderly, while local churches opened their doors every night not just for prayer, but as makeshift sanctuaries against the terror outside. Flyers plastered over phone booths showed composite sketches of two suspects, their likenesses a blur between menace and myth. The dynamic between Kevin and his mysterious partner, a figure later identified as Xavier, was a source of endless speculation. For those who read between the lines of their crimes, there was an unmistakable choreography. Roles traded mid-assault, a strange code in their violence, as if they were locked in a contest not with their victims but with each other. Some cases suggested that Xavier reveled in the theatricality, once arranging a room's contents into a grotesque tableau, another time leaving behind a lipstick-scrawled message on a bathroom mirror. Kevin, on the other hand, vacillated between cold efficiency and terrifying explosions of rage. Even within the insular, often suspicious subculture of Manhattan nightlife, the partnership was legendary. Bartenders and drag queens at Neon Dreams whispered about Kevin's increasingly erratic moods, while those in the know saw bruises on Xavier that couldn't all be explained by accidents. Together they oscillated between periods of frenzied codependence, nights spent plotting new jobs, mornings wrapped in fevered, exhausted sleep, and bitter conflict that sometimes spilled into the street. One onlooker recalled a drunken midnight argument outside a deserted pizza shop, voices carrying just long enough for the words, "You need me" and "You'd be nothing without this," to ring out before the pair vanished into the subway haze. The city's queer communities, no strangers to hiding secrets or rallying together under pressure, swapped theories in the flickering lamplight of back rooms and apartment kitchens. Some clung to the hope that the rumors were exaggerated, fables spawned by desperate media and overzealous police. Others harbored quiet dread, recognizing the pattern of self-destruction that sometimes haunted those pushed to society's margins. Rumors about Xavier's past, whispered stories of a childhood marked by violence, a record in juvenile detention, manipulative charm offset by a hair-trigger temper, circulated like currency among the wary and street-smart. Detectives, compelled by mounting public outcry, began to piece together the timeline. In each case, their unique brand of mayhem left subtle clues: a scarf tied in a particular knot, the lingering aroma of heather cologne, a stolen trinket hawked at the same corner pawn shop. Attempts to turn one accomplice against the other went nowhere. Even when Xavier was briefly hauled in for questioning, he stonewalled with a blend of bravado and feigned innocence, protecting both Kevin and himself in a thick fog of denials and calculated half-truths. The authorities grew increasingly frustrated. Every lead seemed to dissolve into the city's noisy background. Meanwhile, Kevin's own psyche continued its spiral, driven by hatred for what the world had denied him, and the intimacy with Xavier that oscillated between love, obsession, and mutual ruin. He crossed lines he had once sworn never to approach. Above all, what propelled him wasn't just greed or need, but the addicting rush of dominance, the sense that for a fleeting moment, he was powerful, unafraid, finally seen. Each news headline and frightened whispered warning became an affirmation of existence, his shadow flickering larger on the wall with each new atrocity. But cracks had begun to form within the duo. Xavier, increasingly reckless, botched a job on the Upper West Side, triggering an alarm that sent the two fleeing down fire escapes, faces flushed with adrenaline and terror. Kevin blamed Xavier's arrogance, while Xavier mocked Kevin's growing paranoia. Their arguments became more frequent, the tension between them thrumming dangerously close to violence. Neighbors recounted shouting matches separated only by paper-thin walls, glass breaking, frantic apologies, each sign a warning that their alliance was no longer a partnership, but a powder keg. Yet the horror did not abate. Bloodier, more brutal attacks spread through the summer like a fever, the victims mostly elderly women living alone, their lives changed or shattered in the space of a few terrible minutes. Friends and neighbors recognized in these crimes the marks of a personal vendetta, a savagery that seemed almost ritualistic, calculated to instill the maximum terror and helplessness. Across police precincts and newsrooms, speculation intensified. Was this violence fueled purely by criminal intent, or did it mask deeper psychological scars, retribution for lifetimes of rejection, or the provocation of a world too often cold and unyielding? For the city, the question mattered little. Fear had become a constant companion, bleeding into the most ordinary moments. People flinched at late-night footsteps, triple-bolted their doors, installed new locks, and shuttled aging parents out of their apartments and into second bedrooms or the safety of distant suburbs. Emergency city council meetings dissolved into shouting matches over whose neighborhoods were most at risk, and whose taxes should pay for the ever-increasing patrols, alarms, and neighborhood watch programs. Deep inside his own waking nightmare, Kevin clung to the bond with Xavier as both anchor and curse. They sparkled in one another's eyes like mirrors, reflecting the extremes of each other's damage, need, and yearning for connection. At times, the power Kevin felt while acting in tandem with Xavier almost resembled love, raw and misshapen though it was. At others, he saw in Xavier a rival, a threat, the person most likely to destroy everything before the world could do it first. It was this volatile mixture of dependence, contempt, and a shared taste for chaos that made them such an explosive duo, and, ultimately, ensured they would sooner or later implode. The final months of their rampage were marked by the city's increasing desperation to catch them and the pair's own irrepressible urge to push boundaries. Reporters dubbed them the Night Wolves, stoking public terror but unwittingly feeding Kevin's delusions of notoriety. Social networks among the city's marginalized communities buzzed with warnings and code words, but mainstream press coverage often missed the complexity of the situation, the mix of fear, pity, and reluctant fascination their crimes provoked. Late one evening, while crouched behind a barricaded storefront waiting for sirens to fade, Xavier confessed in a whisper to Kevin that he'd always known they would be caught, that maybe this was the only way either of them could ever be truly understood. Kevin laughed bitterly, and for the first time the facade between them truly cracked. Alone in a world that had pushed them both to the edge, their crimes became a language, a fevered bid for belonging and recognition they'd been denied since childhood. By the end, the mystery of the accomplice was more than a police problem. It was a reflection of the city itself. The violence, fed by secrets and shadows, radiated outwards, touching lives that would never know either man by name. As police closed in, and as neighborhoods fortified themselves not just against the pair but the environment of suspicion and fear, it was clear that the legacy of Kevin and Xavier's savagery would linger long after any arrest, leaving questions about responsibility, compassion, and the ways in which society's failures can manifest, sometimes, as pure horror. The raid, and an investigative turning point. As the city's collective anxiety reached fever pitch, the pressure on New York law enforcement reached unprecedented levels. The mayor held nightly press conferences broadcasting somber assurances that the monster or monsters responsible for the rash of crimes would soon be unmasked. Headlines blared in tabloid fonts 6 inches high, "City on edge, manhunt intensifies." But behind the sensationalism, the truth was more chaotic and uncertain than the public realized. Police Commissioner Reyes, a woman famed for her tenacity and intelligence, mobilized a task force comprised of veteran detectives, young patrol officers eager to prove themselves, and analysts adept at assembling disparate clues into elusive patterns. The city was divided into grid sectors, with plainclothes officers and uniformed patrols working in overlapping shifts, their presence on subway platforms, dimly lit sidewalks, and housing project lobbies now as common as graffiti. Detective Anwar Malik, a second-generation Pakistani-American with 10 years on the force, was placed in charge of the main investigation. His approach, methodical, observant but rooted in empathy, contrasted with the older, more jaded lieutenants who grumbled about the futility of big-city police work. Malik insisted on small details, surveillance tapes from liquor stores near every crime scene, spreadsheets of pawnshop transactions, a bulletin board exploding with maps, times, and faded portraits of victims. He personally visited each crime scene, sometimes returning at odd hours to absorb the texture of silence, the layout of a hallway, the angle of moonlight outside a shattered window. But despite the heightened security, the surge of neighborhood watch volunteers, and the relentless chase for leads, progress was agonizingly slow. Every day, Central Command was flooded with calls from terrified citizens reporting shadows outside their doors, footsteps echoing in empty corridors, strangers behaving just a little off. Each tip had to be logged and triaged, and most led nowhere. Many longtime New Yorkers simply didn't trust the police enough to cooperate. Whispers of systemic racism and past brutality haunted the relationship between authorities and the communities most affected, the Black, Dominican, and elderly immigrant residents who found themselves on the front lines of fear. In response, Officer Maribel Santiago, fluent in both Spanish and English, was deployed in Washington Heights to bridge the cultural gap. Her strategy was to partner with community leaders, clergy, and teachers, hosting open forums in church basements and synagogues where rumors could be separated from facts. She listened, offered protection, and slowly won over those who had felt voiceless. Her presence led to the first break in the case. An elderly woman who had narrowly survived an attack finally found the courage to tell her story. Quaking with trauma, her face drawn and ashen, she described her assailant in unusual detail. A scar curving under one eye, the scent of a cheap lavender aftershave, the whisper of a drawl in his threats, details the detective seized upon. Through her testimony and Santiago's patient support, the investigative sketch artist created the first composite image that bore a striking resemblance to Kevin. For the first time, the city had a face for its dread. The composite was released through every major news outlet, and posters plastered across the boroughs. Hotlines rang off the hook as people scrutinized subway riders and glanced sideways at their neighbors. Kevin's face, once anonymous, became the city's avatar of terror. Meanwhile, forensic teams worked around the clock, cross-referencing fingerprints lifted from broken glass and discarded purses. The break came late one Wednesday evening. A partial print from a crime scene in Inwood matched a set in the military database, Kevin's from his dishonorable discharge years earlier. Malik's team, electrified by the match, scrambled to put together a comprehensive timeline, correlating Kevin's periodic disappearances and reappearances with the locations and dates of the highest-profile attacks. But there was still the specter of a second figure, the suspected accomplice who seemed to vanish just as tightly as Kevin himself. Surveillance footage proved maddeningly grainy. Neighbors recalled seeing two silhouettes in a stairwell, but couldn't agree on height or build. Xavier's name surfaced only as bits of gossip from the drag and underground scenes, a handsome, volatile man who clung to Kevin like a shadow. Yet getting hard evidence proved elusive. Every promising lead dissolved in smoke, every eyewitness statement tangled in fear, bias, or plain confusion. With every day that passed, the pressure on Malik and his colleagues grew. Phones rang with demands from City Hall. Newspapers published leaked memos and lines of speculation. As the tension mounted, so did the specter of vigilante justice. Strangers accosted nervous young men near pawn shops, and neighborhoods threatened to unravel under the weight of fear and suspicion. The turning point arrived thanks to a convergence of old-school police work and a moment of desperate luck. On a rain-soaked night, as patrol cars crawled uptown avenues, a suspicious vehicle parked outside a shuttered grocery store drew the attention of Officer Tommy Ung, a rookie barely a month into his solo shift. His gut told him something wasn't right. The passenger inside was hunched low, a duffel bag at his feet. Ung called for backup and approached cautiously. Inside, officers found Xavier, his hands trembling, clearly high and disoriented, and in the back seat, a handful of items reported missing from the last break-in. The arrest sent shockwaves through police headquarters. Pressured by a relentless media and an urgent city, detectives played Xavier against Kevin, leveraging every trick in the book: good cop, bad cop, promises of protection, threats of lengthy sentences. At first, Xavier refused to speak, alternating between bravado and silence. It wasn't until he was shown the battered photograph of Mrs. Perlman, one of their earliest and most tragic victims, that cracks appeared in his bravado. In a tear-choked voice, he confirmed Kevin's involvement and described the escalating violence, the sense of inevitability, and ultimately, his own fear of being abandoned or worse. Thanks to Xavier's confession and GPS evidence collected from his phone, the net tightened rapidly. Officers, armed with search warrants, raided the squalid apartment where Kevin and Xavier had holed up, finding evidence that linked them not only to the most high-profile crimes, but to dozens of lesser-known burglaries that had never made it beyond the local police blotter. In the bedroom, under a loose floorboard, they found a scrapbook, clippings about the crimes, grainy photocopies of newspaper headlines, even some taunting cartoons scrawled in a shaky hand. It was clear Kevin had spent sleepless nights tracking his own legend, both fearful of capture and hungry for notoriety. Within hours, an APB was issued. Kevin, sensing the net closing in, tried to flee to New Jersey but was spotted by a sharp-eyed transit worker who had memorized the wanted posters. A brief foot chase ended in Union City, with Kevin shoved to the rain-slicked pavement by a rookie detective who muttered a prayer of relief. The monster of Manhattan had finally been caught. The period of decline and the moment of revelation. As the police net steadily tightened around Kevin and Xavier, a new disconcerting chapter began. Kevin felt the noose drawing ever closer, the city's watchful eyes tracking his every move, even as he sought new shadows in unfamiliar places. Anxiety prickled at the back of his neck with every siren's wail, every newscaster's grave intonation, every glance from a stranger on the subway. Even the anonymity that New York once granted him now turned heavy, oppressive. To escape the relentless sense of pursuit, Kevin took a desperate gamble. He decided to abandon the city that had for so long both nourished his ambitions and sharpened his despair. Together with Xavier, he headed west. California beckoned, its mythic aura of reinvention catching at the edges of Kevin's tattered hopes. But LA and its outskirts were not the soft dreamland he'd imagined. The daylight there was pitiless, and Kevin found himself a stranger in a land with its own hierarchies and dangers, far from the intricate grid of New York streets. Without money, without friends, adrift in a world of palm trees and concrete, he quickly fell into a spiral darker than before. Jobs were nearly impossible to come by. Xavier's hustles paid less and less, and the couple's unity began to crack beneath the tension of constant fear and enforced idleness. Their crimes became desperate. Petty thefts to stave off hunger, small-time scams too risky for too little payoff. And still, the law seemed to always be closing in. With every failed attempt to outrun poverty in the past, their relationship soured. Kevin's temper, already a legend to those who'd known him back in the Heights, boiled over. Fights with Xavier grew more brutal, arguments snarling late into the night. They moved constantly, flop houses, roach motels, brief stints in abandoned cars, picking up and dropping odd acquaintances, learning to trust no one but each other, and sometimes not even that. The glamour that once flickered in their shared rebellion was gone, replaced by a brittle calculus of survival. Kevin began to sense the limits of his own capacities for endurance, and for cruelty. As their resources dwindled and nerves frayed beyond mending, Kevin made the inevitable choice to return east, haunted by the realization that California had proved no sanctuary, only an echo of old disappointments amplified by new failures. New York's skyline haunted his dreams even from thousands of miles away. He convinced Xavier of one last scheme, a return to the familiar, if treacherous, terrain of their former haunts. Maybe, Kevin reasoned in the tired logic of the desperate, the city that had made them could also hide them, but by now, their infamy had metastasized, and the tabloids' morbid fascination with the night wolves meant every street vendor, barista, and subway cop had their eyes open for even a whiff of scandal. On their return, Kevin's paranoia grew acute. He disguised himself, hair dyed, thrift store clothes, aviator shades worn at dusk, and spent his nights in constant motion, never lingering long enough for anyone to place a name to his face. Xavier, jittery and resentful, alternated between urging a fresh flight south and making wild plans for ever bolder crimes that would replenish their dwindling cash. But the city was no longer just a backdrop, it was a trap. Friends had vanished, neighbors shut their doors, and even the underworld seemed to have tired of the duo's notoriety. Desperate, they staged a final string of burglaries, sloppier and more reckless than anything before, culminating in an ill-conceived robbery on a rain-soaked night in Queens. The victim, a retired teacher whose daughter had long petitioned for more police presence, fought back, dialing 911 mid-attack. The blaring of squad cars arrived nearly instantly, blue lights slicing through the wet midnight like judgment. Xavier managed to escape down the fire escape, melting into the labyrinthine alleyways, but Kevin, panting, bloodied, out of practice, was not so lucky. Cornered in a cluttered backyard trying to climb over a chain-link fence, he was spotted by an alert young officer. At first, Kevin tried his well-worn act of feigned innocence, murmuring apologies, claiming wrong address, pleading mistaken identity. But the officer, recalling the details from the citywide bulletins, the scar below one eye, awkward limping gait, and telltale accent, called in for backup. Minutes later, handcuffed inside a patrol car, Kevin stared dully at the swirling city lights as they sped downtown. He had managed to evade the law for so long it hardly seemed possible this was the end, yet the evidence was damning. Fingerprint analysis, still in its infancy but effective enough for known criminals, matched Kevin to prints recovered from multiple crime scenes. Within hours, detectives were grilling him at the precinct. The press camped outside. Angry crowds gathered, desperate for a glimpse of the face that had haunted their nightmares. Meanwhile, Xavier's brief freedom ran out. He was apprehended 2 days later at a Bronx flophouse, betrayed by a tip from a neighbor swayed by the promise of reward money and a city's collective outrage. Brought in, Xavier initially refused to talk, but under the double pressures of guilt and fear, he began to unravel. His confession, recorded late at night under the glare of a fluorescent bulb, described the toxic alliance, the spiraling violence, and the sense of mutual doom that had driven their final atrocities. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Kevin's mugshot dominated the front pages, framed by lurid headlines and grainy sidebars detailing the litany of charges: burglary, aggravated assault, murder, and conspiracy. At trial, the prosecution painted the partnership as both tragic and monstrous, two damaged souls whose brief flare of love had curdled into a campaign of terror against the city's most vulnerable. Psychiatrists debated the roots of Kevin's rage. Columnists argued over the failures of the social safety net, the blindness of a city too busy to notice its most lost children. In the courtroom, Kevin seemed shrunken, exhausted, sometimes defiant but mostly hollow. He watched, stone-faced, as former friends, club acquaintances, and even his mother were called to testify. The most damning moments came when photographs of the victims were projected for the jury, not just as faceless statistics, but as real people whose absence left gaping holes in their neighborhoods and families. The verdict was predictable. Kevin was found guilty on all counts, sentenced to life without parole. Xavier, in exchange for his full confession and testimony, received a slightly lighter, though still severe sentence. The media, stirring the ashes of the city's fear and fascination, quickly moved to mythologize the pair. Kevin, once an invisible child, now became the cautionary tale, a symbol of urban evil, a vessel onto which the city's anxieties and failures could be projected. Yet, in the silence of his cell, stripped of both infamy and companionship, Kevin finally faced a reckoning more daunting than any judge or jailer, the truth of all that he had lost, and the knowledge that beneath the menace, he remained tragically, irreparably human. A bitter outcome and a lesson learned in blood. The courthouse at Center Street, already soaked in relentless autumn rain, felt heavier than ever on the day Kevin received his sentence. His trial had become a flashpoint for the city, a national fixation that played out across every television and newspaper headline. Families of victims crowded the gallery, clergy and community leaders watched alongside hardened journalists and rookie cops. All eyes, it seemed, were on Kevin, once a ghost in the city's system, now infamous as the architect of its worst nightmares. As the judge's gavel struck, the reverberations traveled further than the polished wooden benches. Kevin stood, shoulders squared but face pale, as the sentence was read, life imprisonment, with no chance for parole. His accomplice Xavier, who had turned state's evidence but not before revealing the horrifying depths of their crime spree, was also sentenced to decades behind bars. The city's thirst for justice had been quenched, but an uneasy aftertaste lingered, one made of trauma, regret, and the gnawing sensation that true closure might never arrive. In the weeks following the verdict, the city of New York mourned publicly and privately. Candlelit vigils were held for the elderly women whose lives had been brutally ended. Blocks once too fearful to unlock their doors found solace, at least temporarily, in the certainty that the two shadows haunting their nights were now caged. But grief remained, an invisible scar that wound through apartments, synagogues, bodegas, and family kitchens. For many survivors, the relief of justice was always intertwined with the heartbreak of irreparable loss. Kevin's fate inside prison proved both a mirror and a cautionary tale. In his first months at Rikers, then a maximum security state facility upstate, he attempted to capitalize on his notoriety. Fellow inmates regarded him with a mix of fear and contempt. Some admired his legend, most saw him as a broken vessel carrying darkness that no one wanted close. He was placed in solitary more than once, both for his protection and because of periodic outbursts that recalled the volcanic rage of his youth. The handful of letters he sent out, to former friends, unlikely supporters, even the press, read like the confessions of a man eternally divided against himself, defiant yet intermittently contrite, proud but so desperately adrift. What haunted Kevin the most was not, as he might have once imagined, the punishment of isolation. Instead, it was the slow, relentless realization that the story he had written for himself, the story of someone finally seen, finally powerful, was just another illusion. In the routines of prison life, stripped of makeup, masks, and the artificial glamour of neon-lit nights, he became once again invisible. His name faded from city headlines as newer outrages, disasters, and scandals took their place. The outside world, even those who once studied every twist of his case, gradually stopped caring, yet the impact of his actions only grew richer in meaning and warning. In the aftermath, city leaders poured resources into mental health outreach, social service programs, and the fragile task of rebuilding trust in fractured neighborhoods. Non-profit groups offered therapy sessions for surviving families and educational programs in schools that used Kevin's story as a stark parable about the dangers of alienation, the importance of community, and the consequences of a society that overlooks its most vulnerable. Television specials, podcasts, and a widely discussed documentary sought to dissect what had happened, unpacking not only Kevin's psychological trajectory, but also the city's complicity in fostering the conditions that allowed such a tragedy to unfold. The lesson, hammered home in editorials and whispered in late-night conversations, was never singular. It was about the corrosive power of abandonment, a warning that children ignored, communities left to fester, and trauma left unaddressed can combine to create outcomes more monstrous than any nightmare. It cautioned against the urge to other or dehumanize. Somewhere inside every villain, the city was forced to see, might be a child who simply wanted to belong. As the years wore on, Kevin became less a person than a symbol, a case file, a teaching moment, a scare story for new social workers and exhausted parents. But for those who still tended to the wounds he'd left, or who remembered the spark in his eyes from a night at Neon Dreams, he lingered as an unsettling reminder. The line between monster and victim is sometimes agonizingly thin.